on behalf of the Department of History, Regis and Mary College, I am ecstatic to welcome you all to this talk session on aesthetic inequalities and immaterial common goods, experiences of the city 12th to 21st centuries. Today, I, Kim Byak Moy, and my friend Aparna Nair from second year History Honours are going to be the event host for today.
We are incredibly delighted to be joined by Professor Arundhati Virmani and Professor Boutier as the speakers for today's event.
Professor Arundhati Virmani specializes in colonial and contemporary Indian history with her works shedding light on the cross-fertilization of perspectives, questions and approaches in the social sciences of Europe and Asia. She has published on national symbolism, emphasizing on the historical, symbolic and political mechanisms and the dynamics of nation building from the colonial times to the present day. Her intellectual inquiries embrace reflections on how social scientists engage with the civic space.
Accompanying ma'am, we have Professor Boutier, a historian specializing in comparative social history of early modern Europe, and he is also the former director of Norbert Elias Centre in Social Sciences from the year 2002 to 2011. His published works include 20 books and more than 100 articles in French, German, Italian, Spanish and English. They show his deep knowledge of the main social, political and cultural dynamics of early modern European society.
Thank you so much, respected professors, for taking time out of your busy schedules to grace our occasion with your knowledge. And without any further ado, I now invite our respected speakers to begin with their session.
Well, thank you very much for your very warm welcome. And yes, well, I am very honored and delighted to be welcomed by the History Department of Jesus and Mary College, where I worked many years ago. I don't like to say how many because it will make me feel terribly old. But this is an institution which is familiar to me, and I'm really happy to be back and addressing you students over here, accompanied by Boutier. So I'm not going to make this a very complicated presentation, or the title of this talk today might seem very complex: aesthetic inequalities and immaterial common goods. I'd just like to say that you know, I edited a book which has come out in 2022, which is called Aesthetic Perceptions of Urban Environments. And many of the thoughts I'm expressing today were developed in the writing of this book, which has brought together more than a dozen social scientists, historians, geographers, sociologists, anthropologists, and architects, practitioners who intervene in the urban environment. But, you know, rather than presenting you with some heavy theoretical fundamentals which led me to into this journey of putting this book together, I'd like to sort of trace it very simply. My husband, Boutier, who's a historian but also my husband, we work in the same institution, which is the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Marseilles. And very often when we're walking to work, we sort of cross the city. It's a half-an-hour walk. And you know, we are constantly having an argument about which route we should take to our office. And Boutier had a tendency to always choose a route that was shorter, very functional, but it was mostly always dirty. And so if you show me the slide, I would, the next one. And the next one? Yeah. So the route he would take would often be something like this. You know, garbage and then dustbins. And I would say that no, I want to walk down a route that gives me a scenic view, a view of the city. Can we come back to the second slide here? The other one, yeah. something like this, you know. When I'm walking from the city, I want to see something pleasant. I don't care if the route is longer, but it's more calming and restful for me than to go along all that garbage where I have to close my nose and my eyes and my ears, and I can arrive in my office feeling kind of relaxed and not hassled and sometimes overwhelmed. And so this was a continuous argument and negotiation that went on, you know. Were we going to take that staircase which was shorter, we were going to take a longer route. Now I won't tell you how many times I won the argument and how many times he won the argument. But this was an interesting reflection because it sensitized me to the fact that living in an urban environment was above all not only about infrastructures and what bus number went to the office, or how could I go, could I take the ferry, because I could also take the ferry, but whether it was primarily an aesthetic experience or not. And what did I mean by an aesthetic experience was, were my sights, you know, fulfilled? Were my senses satisfied? And was I going through this in a restful space? Or was I sort of, you know, defending myself against aggression or dirt or noise or something else that could be terrible? So this was a constant tension. And actually what I'm describing very simply has been described in very knowledgeable ways by a German philosopher, Wolfgang Welsch, who said that we are constantly living in this tension, which is tension between the search for the aesthetic and a move to anesthetize our senses. And all of you go through that, I'm sure. Between, you know, we're not always living in a protected bulle where there are palm trees and birds and water channels. We are constantly confronting the more ugly and the more unpleasant sides of our environment. So we're veering from, you know, a beautiful sight to close your eyes, close your ears, close your nose so that you don't see or smell or hear anything terrible. And so this book is actually born of this constant niggling reflection. And it made me realize that, you know, this is a paramount need for us. But at the same time, it made me realize the profound, so aesthetics is a kind of a common good, you know. It's a common good in two dimensions. One is a moral dimension, which is it's there for all of us to share. And the second dimension is very concrete. It's there for to be redistributed. But are we doing that? Is that happening? I'm afraid no. So it led me to the third point of this book, is that we're living with profound aesthetic inequalities. And this is the greatest shock we have when we're moving to any city space. It could be in Delhi, it could be in Paris, it could be in New York, or the smartest city you could find in the globe today. And today, why is it important to think about aesthetic inequalities, and why is it important to think about immaterial common goods? It's because we are rethinking our cities today. And if you look at the number of conferences and workshops that are happening even at this moment around the world on smart cities, technology, how we're going to connect everybody, and how we're moving into a digital age, which is going to be expressed in our urban environments, we realize that this is becoming a matter for technicians, and the individual is kind of becoming a passive recipient who is just going to receive what he is being given, and he's going to say thank you for giving me a very smart highway, flyovers, etc., etc. But, you know, the individual is being effaced from this landscape. And so this book, which I edited, is a kind of a constant reflection of my daily experience, and it takes root in that rather than from a theoretical position which I set out to demonstrate. So the theoretical axis in this book is very much present. Of course, this is not me or the various authors who have contributed to it, who are inventing their own thoughts without any theoretical foundations. But at the heart of this book is a study of empirical situations, right? So deep aesthetic inequality, which is at the heart of all citizen experiences, and to really get us to explore the question from the perspective of the individual, his subjectivity, his memories, his dreams, her sensory engagements and emotions. So moving away from this desensitization or this anesthetizing one's senses to a deeper kind of consciousness. Now the second event, which was a kind of trigger point, was also in 2005. Now in 2005, what happened in France? I don't know if you can think of what happened in India in 2005. Any striking? Yeah? Ah, okay. Wonderful. I mean, not the earthquake, but yes. No, I mean, I was in France. So yes, this is a very important event. But in France, in 2005, there were lots of urban riots, suburban riots. So what was happening was that in many important cities like Paris, like Strasbourg, like Lyon, young people were burning cars, burning buildings, and there were riots all over the country. So it had become a serious problem of law and disorder because they were protesting against things like unemployment, etc., but also against police brutality. And they took their anger, they expressed their anger. Can I have one of the data slides, perhaps? Not this one. This, voilà. Here's an image of what was happening in France at the time, cars being burnt. And so I think there were more than 8,000 cars, vehicles which were burnt. And in all this upheaval and this confusion, the only city that remained completely peaceful was Marseilles in the south of France. Population, it's a big city, it's the second largest city in France, population of 1 million, which is a very small city if you think about it from an Indian perspective. 25% people from North African origins. So it's not just a very rich city, in fact it's a kind of a very mixed city, and all kinds of people rub shoulders together, rich bourgeois and ordinary people, very relaxed city. I invite you to visit it and put it on the list of your places to visit. But why did Marseille not get absorbed in this wave of violence that was taking place in France? Many theories were proposed by research scholars and social scientists. Some of the explanations were that, okay, there's unemployment, but then all young people in Marseille are involved in the drug trade, which gives them a lot of money, and so they're not worried about, they're not poor. Second explanation, that there's a big control of the mafia, and that sort of doesn't want disorder because it will upset their trade. A third explanation was that, yes, they're very involved in a football mania, and so that also absorbs all their passions and energies, and it keeps them on a positive path. All these are, explanations, partial explanations, functional explanations. But then I was kind of consulting my general practitioner, my doctor one day, and he said, no, this is all right, but there's actually a deeper explanation. And I said, what do you think that is? And he said, it's because the poor people in Marseille, due to the policy of social housing, they have the best views on the Mediterranean. And even the richest people of the city do not get such spectacular views. So they wake up in the morning and they see the blue Mediterranean before their eyes, whereas people in the suburbs in Paris and Lyon or Strasbourg, what do they see? They see the rain, they see grey skies, they see concrete buildings, skyscrapers, concrete, there is no greenery. So they wake up, you know, feeling totally depressed. The day is only going to get worse. They're going to go to office in the metro, they'll spend hours. So the whole experience is dark and gloomy. Whereas in Marseilles, blue skies, sunshine, it's an aesthetic experience. And he said this is what makes the difference, and it keeps people in a kind of a happier frame of mind. So I don't know if you find this a convincing explanation or not, but I thought it was very interesting, and it certainly draws attention to the fact that, you know, the aesthetic dimension is a primordial dimension in our lives. And you will see this when we dress, at least girls, ladies, and I know my husband is quite indifferent to this, but we are constantly preoccupied with an aesthetic dimension. And not just human beings, because in a previous book I did, there was a piece on technology, and somebody was interviewed who worked on, you know, making computers for Apple. And the question he was asked was, when do you decide that this computer is a finished product? Kind of roots of this reflection on, you know, questions like aesthetic inequalities. So today, I mean, you know, anybody who's working on urban spaces or cities, there's so much literature on it. Everybody is writing on it. Sociologists, geographers, historians, of course, but also architects, municipal bodies are concerned with this question. But all this reflection is linked to, you know, political decisions or associative bodies, urbanists or political parties. And they deal with matters like energy, uses of energy, urban gardens, parks, etc. And if you think of, you know, some of the very ambitious projects around cities today, there's an amazing project around Toronto, the city of Toronto, which they're going to transform into something very futuristic with waterfronts, and it's going to be a new way of living in the urban space. Now that's very good, but I want to draw attention here to the ordinary aesthetic experiences which are very often forgotten. So, you know, Dipankar Gupta, the sociologist, he pointed out once that in the master plan of Delhi, only 6 of the 300 pages were, had the mention of aesthetics, and that also randomly. So, can one analyze how residents feel about their relationship to the city? So it is this lived relationship that is at heart of this inquiry. So this is an approach that is not, you know, it doesn't seek to propose a set of rules or prescriptions. We have to think about the city like this and not like that, but it's a collective analytical work, and it looks at the question of an aesthetic relationship with the city over a very long time period. You know, if we're talking about aesthetic inequalities and common goods, it's not, we have to think about it not just in the immediate moment, but over a very long period. And so we can start thinking about it like I've done from the 13th century onwards, when Italian municipalities were rethinking about how to design urban spaces, and instead of the usual aristocracy or nobility that decides all these questions, the community was entering the picture and deciding, you know, what were the needs of the community. It could be corporate guilds, it could be other groups, but that was a definite shift about, and so here we are now, over the long time period, you can see that from the community, we are now taken up with the individual experience. And so perhaps the time has come to place the individual at the heart of this inquiry. And then yeah, you know, this is a painting I'd like you to see by Mario Stironi, an Italian painter, who described, I don't know if you can see it very well, buildings, and there's just one individual there. So he's describing the angst and the, you know, the alienation felt by an individual in very in the city. And you can see by the colors and this kind of emptiness, which is not real, but which portrays the feelings of the individual living in this space. So, you know, many situations are explored. This theme is explored in many different empirical situations. So it shifts from Shanghai, where one of the historians has looked at the practice of placing billboards in the streets. You know, we see them all the time here, but Shanghai in the 20th century was really the municipal bodies were thinking about whether billboards should be allowed, whether neon lights should be allowed, and so Chinese concepts and notions of what the urban space multidisciplinary approach. That is, it has involved architects, practitioners, it has involved sociologists, historians, and other participants in urban change. What does this mean? This means that they are all mobilizing different methods of inquiry to think about both common goods and think about aesthetic inequalities. And, you know, historians are using literary material. I myself have looked on how urban realities are represented through cinema and literature in India in the 1950s onwards. And other historians have used archives, of course, but a medium like billboards. Anthropologists have used their own methods of interviewing people, and but also films, and different concepts have been mobilized. What is aesthetic capital? And what is small aestheticization? I'm just throwing out these concepts so that you can think about it, and perhaps through your daily experience you have a different understanding of what is aesthetic capital. And can we, I mean, do we inherit it? How can we develop it? How can we make it grow? What do we mean by small aestheticization? And how can these notions help us overcome the aesthetic inequalities we live with and which we are immersed in? Then we have, for example, a sociological take on understanding these questions, the concept of life forms. But what do we mean by a life form, and how does it translate at the level of a neighborhood? Through noise, and what is this noise? What does noise do? And one of the chapters in this book, for example, looks at the film, Spike Lee's film on Do the Right Thing, and which shows that how noise actually determines, you know, or leads to violence and can lead to conflict in a very small neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. So, one of the most interesting interviews in this book is by an Italian art curator who worked in Delhi. You've probably heard of this organization, non-profit organization called START, which has been responsible for the art district in Lodi Colony. I don't know if you've seen the mural paintings which are constantly renewed in this district, and she was a co-founder, and she draws out the specificities of Indian cities, which for her, coming from an Italian background, she's from Rome, and she worked as curator in the Museum of Contemporary Art called Marseilles, And for her, Indian cities are represented by chaos. But from that chaos, she thinks there are greater possibilities for creative approaches and unpredictable approaches, because chaos is perhaps more conducive to, more open to plural experiences than, straight lines and the broad avenues which are felt to characterize the aesthetic norms. So, I will just say a few lines on some of the key notions that I've mobilized to structure all the articles in this book. First of all, one of the most important key notions is that of experience. And experience is a word and a whole field that was developed by the Marxist British historian E.P. Thompson. I don't know if many of you are familiar with his books, Making of the English Working Class or Customs in Common. He's a historian we often read when we were postgraduates. And this is a concept which I feel is very useful and rich to think about notions like common goods and inequality, experiencing the city beyond the norms and the guidelines. You know, the way you personalize your, I don't know, your Instagram or your stories, or so in the same way, there is also a possibility of projecting this experience. So in order to survive this urban jungle, what is our freedom of maneuver? And how can we recuperate? How can we appropriate this freedom? What can we do in that space and within those forms which have been created, those scapes, landscapes which have been created for us? What is our freedom of action and maneuver, which can transform our personal experience? One of the philosophers, a French philosopher, Jean-Marc Bess, states that inhabiting the city is not a planned activity. It can be improvised, and a plan is certainly laid out. The streets are laid out. You can't change, Jesus and Mary Marg into something else. I mean, as individuals, we cannot do that. But so what is our scope of action? So this is really an invitation for you to think actively and proactively about the space you inhabit and see what you can do in that space. And be aware of the kind of emotions, that are constantly coming up, which you're perhaps suppressing, or perhaps you're finding them interesting to relate to that urban space. So the second concept, which is critical to this book, is of course common good, aesthetics as a common good. It continues to be advanced as an argument for many people to now argue that aesthetics is a fundamental right also. It is one of the fundamental rights. It hasn't been included as such, but this is the next stage when we can affirm it as a fundamental right for everyone, that it's an intrinsic part of public spaces, of daily routines of work, that enable citizens to forge new social meanings of justice. And it can appear as an inviolable right of ordinary citizens. So as I said, common good can be understood in a double sense, as opposed to special interests, which is very interesting. It's not just reserved for one person or one segment of the population. And the second aspect about common goods is that it is its commitment to universal enrichment. And that's procured in common and redistributed in common. And that honors human plurality. So there's a very strong moral argument here. And I think that's one of the points about, that many philosophers like Jacques Rancière have made about redistribution of the sensible. And this also kind of makes us feel that we have to address this question of aesthetic inequalities in a very urgent way. Like, do poor people have the right to just wander around in the cities? Perhaps not. And you know, many of the books that have been written about what was called La Flânerie, or the promenade, who has the right to do these promenades? Who can just wander around, and where? And now we know that the integrated lawns are encouraging people to come and inhabit them in these ways. But we need to kind of really think about the city space in these terms. So I would say that the originality of this book, which, you know, the theme of aesthetic inequality and common good is at the heart of this book, taken in the long term, long historical evolution, is that it doesn't defend a thesis, but it explores and experiments with sources, with methods, and with concepts. And each author is kind of choosing his own concepts, some of which I pointed out. But I think the book also carries a warning that urban planning, and without the acknowledgement and without the inclusion of this subjective dimension, or without the recognition that the sensitive can go into the wrong hands, it presents the risk of the end of democracy. They're very aware of the aesthetic elements, and this is a German, earlier that there was a German traveler who comes to London and who's very struck by the lighting system, and he says this is wonderful. And the prince who was visiting London thought that the lights had been put on for his benefit. And he didn't realize that actually there was an urban development and lights were open to everyone. And this is, you know, what was happening in the cities. That this is a page taken from the diary of a guy called Francis Place, who's describing what he sees from his bedroom. And he's seeing all kinds of coaches and carts. I mean, it's total chaos. So 19th century European city was total chaos. And it's perhaps what Chandni Chowk would be today. And, you know, but we will have some interesting reflections from medieval Indian historians who can compare the state of the city in medieval India, and would probably feel that, yes, this was a more highly developed urban arrangement, you know, and a more imaginative and a more pluralist urban arrangement than what was happening in Europe. I feel that, but I'm not a specialist author. And then the next slide, perhaps. Oh yes, I couldn't resist this. This is a painting by an Italian painter called Boldini, and this is a painting of the newspaper seller. And this is in 1878. So he's doing a painting of that, but it shows you all the different trades that were, you know, part of of city life and which have gradually disappeared. And I remember when I was a child, there was always a guy going around who used to sell safety pins and all, and he would yell out, "Titch button le lo," you know, and then the guy who was piercing ears, he had his own. I think Jean Boutier is going to come back to this. The next slide. Yeah, so this is a slide from the Lodi Colony Art District, just to show you how we can relate to, you know, artistic productions, and this little image or photo of children sitting and playing their games. There are some more slides about the right. To the right is a view of Marseilles, one of the streets we have the option of going through to go to our place of work. On the left is a car dump in Lodi Road. The next slide is from Lodi Colony. And the cyclist is not aware that he's cycling through clouds. But if he just looked up. The last two photos are from Buenos Aires, from an art district called the La Boca. And to the right, you can see, even if, you know, people are inhabiting these spaces in very different ways. Somebody's selling earrings, somebody is just leaning against the wall to make a telephone call. But you know, this is not a very this is a very unconscious and natural way of relating to our urban environments. And this wall, for example, is so much more pleasant than a wall which is stained or, you know, which is smelling of urine. Or the fact that we are painting this wall also calls for us to change our habits and experiences and perhaps not throw chewing gum or etc. So just being aware of this aesthetic dimension in its various ways is a call to think about aesthetics in a different way, not something reserved for our personal use or in our homes or in our own gardens, but also in a wider shared environment, a common environment which we are all engaging in collectively. So I will stop there. Did I talk?
No, it's okay.
And so I'm very open to thank you. But you know, well, questions and answers, sometimes it's paralyzing because, oh God, I don't have a question. But we'd be very happy to hear your own thoughts or your own experience, something you saw which struck you when you were coming to college or when you go back. What is it that shocks you? What is it that you like or in your neighborhood? I'd be deeply interested to hear your experiences of early modern European cities. So he will present some fragments from there, and then we'd be very happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Very much for this very kind and very interesting invitation, because I have to say that contrary to Arundhati Virmani, it's my first visit to Jesus and Mary. But at the same time, I have the impression that it's a place I know since a very long time, because Arundhati told me a lot about the place where she taught some years ago, and convinced me that she has a very good memory of the place. So I'm very happy to meet her. First of all. Second point, thank you very much to give us, with this first talk, a very large introduction about how we historians work. That means very often we are developing new approaches because we use our experience, our way of living in our present world to change the way of interrogating the past or searching the past. And so I think all she said was very important. I will take the opposite way. I mean, I took some very historical moment to try to propose what I could call an archaeology of the ordinary aesthetic experience of the city. So she explained how she had built this new kind of approach, which is not at all, like very often it is done, a functionalist approach. What are the functions we need? What do we need in a city? Means of conveyance, buildings, schools, university, hospitals, and so on, which is very important. But at the same time, we may be satisfied by this kind of good organization of a city, but maybe we have some feelings which are a little different. And I will try not to examine the functional constitution of early modern cities, but the way ordinary people, I would say ordinary, more or less ordinary people, because they know how to write, how to read, so which is not something extremely common during the early modern period. But I would say unknown people may talk about their experience, very important concept, of the cities which they looked at. So, and explain why this expression. From archaeology, which is a well-known concept which was used by the French philosopher Michel Foucault, as a kind of double meaning or double use. It's considering the genesis of something, you know, to take a long-term approach to understand the origin and the development of something, doesn't matter. But at the same time, archaeology has another meaning. If you go to a place where there are no scalings, you don't see anything. Everything is hidden under in the ground, in the earth. So archaeology is the work, is the fact of excavating. That means transform something invisible into something visible. So, and I think for most of the European actors or European inhabitants of cities, they didn't have any clear conscience of what they were living. The main difficulty for the historian of early modern Europe, and I think same thing maybe for medieval India, is that it's very difficult to write an history of social and individual experiences. Obviously, in Europe we have a lot of what we call, since the Dutch historian in the 70s proposed this expression, ego documents. That means documents which are written at the first person, and the text is written at the first person, and it expresses feelings, intimate perceptions, subjective discourse. Very often, it's something which is very, I would say, which has the appearance of objectivity. The text tells us some facts. It's a narrative of facts. So I went there at this time, it was dark, I opened the gate, and so on. Or I went to the army, I killed 20 enemies, and what did you feel doing that? And there is no element of this kind of feeling. So I decided to use some specific text, I will explain, and using what the Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg called slow reading of text. That means don't hurry. Sometimes you have to read several times the same text, and you will discover that there are some very small bits of text, some expressions, some verbs, some adverbs, some I don't know what, which tells you more than the whole text. So this is the kind of thing I tried to do, and it's very difficult because I had to read dozens of texts to extract some very small pieces. And then you always say, but is it really representative? But at the same time, when you talk about subjective things, if something is telling us about his feeling, you can say, it happened, it was his feeling, or her feelings. It's not false or true, it's a sentiment. And there is no truth in this kind of impression. You can tell the truth or not, but this is not the case. Because they are not telling, they can tell false facts, but it's more difficult to say false impressions. And we can discuss this problem if you like. So my fundamental choice was to use, we have very few texts about inhabitants expressing their feelings towards their own, the place where they are inhabiting. And so I used travel accounts, necessarily from, foreigners, not inhabitants, but people coming from outside and discovering a city. And so there is a lot, we have a lot of, it would be the same thing in India or in Asia, everywhere, but there are a lot of travelers going across or traveling across a huge continent and looking at realities they don't know at all. They don't know at all. This is specifically interesting problem because they travel for different purposes, of course. They could travel for trade, they could travel for military purposes, they could travel for political purposes if they are ambassadors, for example, or they could travel also for religious purposes if they are pilgrims, and there's a lot of pilgrimage in Europe. Go to Rome, go to St. James of Compostela in Spain or in other places. Every country has a specific place for pilgrims. So, but if you look at some more, I wouldn't say learned, but more, let's say learned in a very banal meaning, they quite often they had read other travel accounts before, or they were traveling with guidebooks since the beginning of the 16th century. Guidebooks is a kind of literary genre which is developing a lot, and you have hundreds and hundreds of guidebooks in different languages. At the beginning, mainly in Latin, Italian, French, and then in all the languages you can find in Europe. So, travelers were not unprepared when they were traveling, because they had to know the dangers, they had to know what were the resources of the place they were visiting, and so on. So, if it's a discovery, it may be the discovery of an unknown reality, or it will be the shock when they discover a reality which maybe is quite different from what they read before. So anyway, that is a kind of shock, or a strong feeling. Shock maybe it's excessive, but a lot of travelers express their feelings in terms of shock, of analysis of the senses by different disciplines. And I will use this kind of material conceptualization which were developed in this field by different disciplines, but also by historians. And this is a series, a very interesting and large series, collective, of course, collective book, which was published by Bloomsbury, London in 2014, which is called The Cultural History of the Senses. And each book is dedicated to a period: ancient period, medieval time, Renaissance, Enlightenment, 19th century, 20th century. There are 6 volumes, more or less organized in the same way, so you can read, chapters. If you are interested by a specific approach, you can read chapters about this specific approach from antiquity to the modern and contemporary period. And I think it's the first large overview of this kind of field. So history, cultural history of the senses. So this is the main framework I worked in for this book. And I used 3 key concepts. I mobilized 3 concepts for this kind of analysis according to 3 senses situated in a certain hierarchical order, because they are not at the same level. Some senses are more important in a specific period, and individual relate more on some senses to approach and to describe and to feel the real world. The vision and the concept will be the landscape. The smelling, and there will be the smellscape. And these are not my inventions. They were proposed by specific scholars. And I will use also the sounds, the hearing, and there is a concept of soundscape which was developed by a theorist of music in the 70s in the States. And I will start with the idea of landscape. In the 30s, a very important French historian, Lucien Febvre, who was on the founders of the Annales School, tried to give importance. He wasn't very successful in this time. Importance to feelings, sentiments, sensibility, you would say. You have to. Actors are not all rational. They are moved by, their own sensibilities, and sometimes which could be qualified as irrational. But you are not irrational. They are not without any logic. There is a logic of sentiments, and as there is a logic of your action, and so on. So, and it's a little different from what Marc Bloch, the other founder of the Annales, called mentalities. Because Flem was, even if he was kind of social historian, was very interested by individuals. And most of these books are based on individual experiences and not on, you know, statistical general analysis. The first very important book he wrote was about Luther, and it's not a biography of Luther, but it tried to understand why Luther changed religion. So what he felt necessary to develop a new approach to Christianism. And so it's a very short period. It's not the whole life of Luther. It's a short period. And he did several books about when there was a discussion in the 30s about atheism and the birth and the development of atheism. And he used a very important literary work, which are the 4 volumes by François Rabelais. It's an imaginary narrative of a giant and so on. I don't develop the theme, but Rabelais was using the term atheist. And so Ferb said, but does this word has this word the same meaning as today? Does it mean that they don't believe in God, or is it something different? Silence in the end of 15th, 16th, and 17th century. It was not possible to have this kind of tool. So, you know, and there is other research by Feb, which use this kind of biographical and individual approach to explain not the individual, but a question through the experience of an individual. Bloch, on the contrary, is with the idea of mentality, propose something more general. It's a framework, you know. You are living in a society, and in this society there are some cultural frames you are not obliged to share, but maybe you don't realize that you are sharing them even if you don't want to do it. So I will follow, in this case, I will follow Lucien Febvre and this more individual approach to try to understand this kind of you know, individual experiences. So the first meaning is landscape, and it's very interesting because I will take three or four examples. What is the experience of someone who is arriving to a new city and looking at it? So this is the first. Oh yes, first of all, yes. First of all, just a point I wanted to develop before that, and say that the difficulty of an inquiry about feelings. This is an extract of a guidebook published in French, Dictionnaire historique de la ville de Paris, so it's historical dictionary of the city of Paris and its surroundings. It's published in 1779, I think. And so it's just at the beginning, you know, the preface, and the author is telling the reader that if you are a traveler and you want to write travel accounts, you add 2. And this is the list. To describe an immense city with appearance, surprises, and mazes, to lead a foreigner through its squares and streets, to teach him its name and etymology, to enter with him into its temples, its churches, palaces, and gardens, if he is aware, the traveler is aware of it, to accompany him to libraries and rarities, living through the archives of its ancient buildings, attending its shows and amusement, going for indoor and outdoor walks, visiting the surroundings within a radius of 20 leagues, to get to know the song, the production, the churches, the castle, the resort. Where are the feelings in this list? You know? This is what you have to do. If you are, it's a kind of, if you take a guide now today, you have to within the main mosque or the main cathedral, you have to visit the main museum, you have to visit this, and so on. But where are the feelings in this kind of literature? So it's quite difficult to do that. So, first of all, landscape. I had forgotten, sorry, this slide, which is quite interesting. Next slide, please. This is an engraving which is in a book, which is Universal Geography, published by a German, Sebastian Münster, in the midst of the 16th century. And this is the typical way of approaching the city. You are outside, you are coming, you are riding a horse, maybe, and you see the city. And the city is, for a traveler, first of all, a kind of profile, you know. So you can identify a city by its own profile. The profile is a kind of signature for a city, because each city has a specific profile. If you look at the profile of Manhattan, you say, oh, yeah, this is Manhattan. If you look at the huge tower in Dubai, you say, oh, I know the profile, this is Dubai. So it's, in the early modern period, it was exactly the same thing. First of all, you can identify the city through its profile. And it's very typical because the experience of the traveler became also a frame for depicting a city. In this kind of book, which is not a travel book, it's a large book, very heavy, you can travel with it. There's about 100 views of cities which are mainly profiles. Okay, but just go on a little. I'll give you some other examples. This is very interesting because you understand that this profile is not a small part, you know, on the side of the view. You see, there is a man sitting, looking at the city, and at the same time, designing. He's drawing, and he's drawing what he's supposed to see, and is transforming into a design his own perception, his own feeling. So we don't have to fall into this piège, into this trap, because there's a lot of studies about this kind of paintings or drawings or engravings, and we know very well that it was not possible to have such an experience because from the same place you couldn't see at the same time the whole city, and the engraving is the production of a series of different perceptions and putting them together in a kind of collage. But anyway, that means that this is what the kind of experience you may have when you are approaching a city. But once you are inside, I think it's very different experience. It's a kind of banal topos, you know, we can say topos, which is called the Chaos of Paris. There is a lot of text, there are poems, there are different images, engravings, which try to depict what is the real street life in 17th city, European city. And we could take, you know, half an hour to look at everything, you know, all the elements, animals. We can find horses, you can find cows. It's very difficult, but yesterday I was looking at it very seriously and I found 2 cows. There are sheep, yes. And sheep, yes, sorry. And you may find different social classes, because there are rich nobles in their carrots, so their chariot. You see that in the middle of there are minimum 2 or 3 of them in the middle of the image. You have all the shops which are on the bridge, on each side of the bridge, you see, there are shops. And you may, anyway, you have a lot of incidents, woman who are wearing a kind of pot of water or something else, and the pot is broken on the pavement, and there are tensions, fights between people, and so this is the chaos of I would say a big European city view, and I will develop this point just a little bit further. So anyway, second way of looking at the city, it's very interesting because it's an experience which is described by many travelers. So first they approach the city, they saw the profile, the landscape, then they go through the gates and they go to their hotel, their auberge. Inn, that's right, thank you. And then they walk through the streets, and very often they say we went to the highest point in the city, which is, in this case, quite often the steeple of the main church or the cathedral. And from the steeple of the cathedral, the look at the city is very different. They see kind of more or less organized city with a specific form, which is more or less circular in general. And the form of the city is also an aesthetic element, because does the city, having a nice, is the city having a nice shape, or is it something very horrible and chaotic? And this is a very interesting map, and it's quite an exceptional map. It's a map of the city of Strasbourg, which is a French city near to Germany, next to Germany, in eastern France, which has been, we think, ordered by the municipality of the city and designed in the midst of the 16th century, and which was designed from the steeple of the cathedral. Maybe you don't see it very clearly, but on the original map, there is a small design of, you see the cathedral, which is horizontal. I don't have
Pointer.
Okay, anyway, if you look at the inferior part, there is a large, and it is from this point that the city map was designed. You see, so it represents the experience of a traveler going to the main point in the city, going up to the steeple of the cathedral and looking at the city. Oh yes, you're trying to. Thank you. Yes, a little more on the left, on the left, on the left. Yes, much more. Left and down. Yes, thank you. Yes, and just a little up. Yes, thank you very much. Not too much. Yes, a little more. Okay, just a little more. No, that's enough. You see? So it's on the image, which is a photo, it's seen horizontally, but in fact this representation of the cathedral with its steeple on the left part has to be vertical on the map. So it's a three-dimensional map, you see, in a certain way. And it indicates the place from where the map was designed, and from where the city was. So, okay, thank you very much. Next one, please. And this is, it could be a transition. Arundhati is a very famous traveler at the end, a British traveler at the end of the 18th century, because he is a specialist of cultivation and is doing a large inquiry about the different way of cultivating the earth in Europe. And he traveled mainly in France and in Italy and wrote a very interesting, very long, interesting journal. And this is, you see, October 1787, and he is describing his visit of Paris. So I read. From the tower of the cathedral, same point that's 2 centuries before, the view of Paris is complete. You can see all Paris, the whole Paris. You can see the whole city. It is a vast city. Even to the eye, important. That I've seen London from St. Paul's, St. Paul's Cathedral, which is the main church in London. Being circular gives an advantage to Paris. But a much greater, and this is that we are entering into not the simple description, but the feeling of the travel. But a much greater is the atmosphere. It is now so clear, the clouds of cold smoke that enveloped London always prevents a distinct view of that capital, but I take it to be 1/3 of less larger than Paris. So the end is just, you know, the result of his evaluation of the city. But the very interesting point is the clouds of coal smoke that envelop London always prevent a distinct view of that capital. I think it's one of the first perception or description of air pollution of a big city, because London was becoming a very industrial city using coal, which was not the fact in Paris, and the atmosphere was very different. So you see that even in a very simple and which seem to be objective description, it's a big city, circular, so some feelings are slightly being introduced. This is what I wanted to explain you when I was speaking of telling you about short, slow reading, you know. Just part of the sentence. It's very interesting. Anyway, and I will go next to the next one. The next one is quite difficult. Maybe we won't have time to look at it, but yes, but it could be difficult to find on YouTube. I don't know if you could access YouTube. Yes, this is, you know, the address on YouTube. And it's a very interesting experiment which was made by a team of architects and historians and published in 2014 of the soundscape of Paris at the end of the 18th century. So soundscape, I told you, soundscape is a notion which was proposed by an American theorist of music.
Yeah, photograph the address and you can share it and listen.
Yes, you see that between the IP and 1EHE, there are two.
Underscore.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
With the, sorry, yes, you see them because they are taken to the line, and so anyway, you could know, you will be able, I think, will be able to look at it. And so it's at the same thing. At the same time, it's very interesting and very disappointing. So it shows you, first of all, the interior landscape of the city. And it's very interesting because it's a part of the city which is very crowded, because in many European cities, there were houses on bridges. Huge houses were built on the main bridges of the city. So, and as bridges, as you know, are one of the main, you know, roads or streets, and where everyone is taking because they have to cross the river. So it was a very crowded place. But at the same time, crowded but a closed space, because there were huge walls on each side of the bridges. So this is the first point. And so she's a lady. She used a lot of paintings we have of Paris in the second half of the 18th century, showing places, buildings, and streets, and so on, to give a real view of the streets. But they are fixed. They are not fixed views all the time. They put some movements, but the main difficulty is to put inside people, animals, and so on, because she would have to take, you know, films and so on. And she didn't do that. So it's strange because you have the landscape, we have the noises in the city, but you don't have the people inhabiting or going through the city. So it's kind of an empty city, and you have to imagine where the sound comes from. Okay? I don't know if I'm very clear, but it's quite easy. I'm sorry, the document is in French, but there is very few words, and it's mainly, you know, so you will hear the shouting of the people, the noise of the animals, of the carriages, and everything else. And I will come to this idea of soundscape. It's soundscape, not noisescape. And this is the main difference. Soundscape, why? Because, as Arundhati suggested, most of these sounds were not disturbing things, but they were elements of a kind of information system which was used to give the people notion, information they needed in their daily life. For example, bells of churches are ringing. Why? Because there is some office, there is some ritual, there is some mass in the church. But also because there is an important announcement from the king, some new law, some new decision. Because it's a peace treaty has been signed. This is the end of the war. And so it's important, everyone has to know that this is the end of the war. So the ringing of the bells were not a simple religious, we're not ringing only religious information, but a lot of signification. There were all the, let me say, cris de Paris, the shouting of, cries of Paris. Cries of Paris or cries of London, for example. There's a lot of literature and of music about it. If you look at, if you just do a small research about cries of London, for example, you will find all the literature, a lot of poetical literature. There are very famous pieces of music, I think by John Dolan or other ones. And what are these cries? They are mainly professional cries. And each profession has a specific way of announcing that they were coming, they were bringing some food, some service, so. And these are the cries of a big city. And these cries disappeared, I think, quite recently. But in the 17th, 18th century, there was a huge number of different cries which were used to identify people or services in the city. So sounds were not something disturbing. Sound was a part of a huge information network in a period when there were no socials, no radio, no television, no newspapers. No newspapers are the first building in a certain way an information system. And this sound, when the city developed, when the city becomes an industrial city, there is a lot of noises which are here, new means of conveyance, and so on. And now we know all that, and we like quiet places. And there is an interesting testimony. It's a British traveler staying in Paris, beginning of the 19th century. He's staying in a flat. He has rent a flat in one of the chic neighborhood of Paris, Quartier Saint-Germain, southern part of the city. And he writes, oh, this is very amazing because I'm in a very lively neighborhood. There's a lot of people around. It's such a quiet place. So that means, something different is something has changed. So I would be able to do the same thing with smell, dirty smell, and so on. So I'm just going to the next part of, and so I wanted to talk a little about it, the way of how to feel a city. And there is a very interesting, maybe you know the French novelist Stendhal, which is one of the main 19th century French novelists. And Stendhal was inhabited for a long time in Italy, and he brought a very interesting observation about the main Italian cities. And he went seven times to Rome, and so he knew the city quite well. And he says, oh, now I don't need to follow all these do's and don'ts which are in the guidebooks. I want to roam around, to walk around without specific purposes, to feel the city. And this is something new, I think. And quite often now in many essays by social scientists, this kind of idea of the wanderer, the people or the man or the woman who is roaming around in a city without specific purpose, is attributed to the very important Marxist philosopher Walter Benjamin in his book, which is called, I think in English, Paris, Capital of the 19th Century. The book of the passages, something like that, I don't know the English form, the livre de passage. There are very specific kind of way of going through the city, not using the main street, but possibility of going through the buildings. And if we do a kind of archaeology of this idea, we can go back to the 18th century And I will give you a very nice and not well-known author, which is a very, at this time, very famous novelist, Nicolas Rétif de la Bretonne, who wrote a huge series of 15 volumes about the Nights of Paris, or the Nightly Observer, nightly, I don't know, the Observatoire Nocturne. The Night Observer. So, and this is his own representation as a wanderer in the nights, in the streets of Paris during the night. And you see, it's amazing because he put an owl on his cap, and the owl is a symbol of nightlife. And to say that nightlife is something not something absurd, it's something very natural. You know, there are birds which are living during the night and not during the day. So he's doing like natural, like the owl. So and it's very interesting because he's wandering through the cities and giving a lot of experiences, what he sees, what's happening during the night, and so that he showed that city life is as lively as day life. And you have to read it. so it would just to conclude my talk about, you know, we are interesting. I didn't took time. Another talk.
I took too much time.
No. It could be about you know, the experiences of night traveler, or not traveler, or night wanderer in the city, in a big city, which is Paris, at the end of the 18th century, and his way of feeling the city. Thank you. Now it's your turn.
Professor Boutier, I was quite fascinated by that painting that you showed of William Hogarth, the everyday life of Paris, I think. Yes. People drinking gin and just lying around and things like that. So I think that is what you also wanted to also show, that it's the everyday lived experience of the ordinary people in cities, how they vary from one city to another. So thank you for that. But I have my question for Professor Arundhati Virmani. You have worked with your chapter, one of your chapter in this book is on cinema in India post 1950s and the representation of the urban space. So what is coming to my mind is also the song "Do Dewane Shehar Mein, Raat Mein, Dopahr Mein, Aashiana Dhoondte Hain." So that particular song. So I wanted to ask you if you could also kind of give a few insights on that chapter that you've written on the literary representations of Indian cities in cinema and in, of course, literature as well. So does it actually depict the ordinary life as well, or do you see a larger, a normative way of looking at the city in Indian cinema?
At risk of go on talking, but very shortly, why I wanted to write that was precisely in the 1950s, there were so many grand plans about designing cities. Chandigarh, Delhi also, master plans, other big cities coming up in India, Gandhinagar, etc. And many foreign architects were recruited to design these cities. And I wanted to look at the cinemas that were being made. Of course, we know the Bengal school of cinematographers, Satyajit Ray, Ritwik Ghatak, etc., who are describing and portraying the experiences of alienation and oppression that individuals and families are facing in these huge cities. Mahanagar, I'm thinking of. So cinemas, cinema in many of these films, one of which I examined in my chapter is Sheher or Sapna. And I think it gives you a glimpse into the feelings and the strategies of ordinary people. How do they cope with these huge urban marvels which are being constructed? Whom are they benefiting? And how, what space is there for ordinary people? When in Sheher or Sapna, the guy comes from his village and he's sleeping on the pavement and looking at these mansions, and if you look at cinema from the 1960s, Sheher or Sapna, and then you look at Anand Patwardhan's films on Bombay, or even if you look at documentaries on Delhi, they show you the real experience of jhopdi walas, and then refugees, where do they go, villagers, they're working as labor, where do they go? The same thing happened during COVID. Where did all these people, they had no place to go. And they all had to, we all saw images of how they walked miles and miles to find a place to be in. And so this urban space is not even, they're there like they're migrant birds. And I thought that rather than work with plants and people, I would look at this, because if you think of Arvind Adigar's novel, The White Tiger, it's a wonderful portrayal of, life on the pavements where they're cooking their rice and then people going by in their cars, and these two worlds are coexisting in that same urban environment. One is cocooned in an air-conditioned car with tissue and to protect herself, who can't even lower the window. The others are all out there. This is what you find in Guru Calcutta, and life is going on in the gullies. And you're going past the gully, you're participating in a family's activities there, having a bath, and you're walking into their houses and out of their houses in Calcutta. So it's the juxtaposition of these different experiences which is so vibrant that I wanted to bring forth in this chapter. And Sheher or Sapna was a film I saw when I was a child. I mean, not a child, but sorry, I'm not so. But I saw, I was very young. And my father took me to see this film, and he said, this is a wonderful film. I must say that as a young child, I did not appreciate it. Kind of tough. Then I came back to it, and I think it's a wonderful documentary. I don't know if you've seen it. Have you seen Sheher or Sapna? No. I invite you to see this. It's a wonderful film. Nichanagar, absolutely. This guy's Devanand's brother, no? What was his name? Chetanand. Yes, it was one of the first films that won an Oscar, or no, it won an award at Cannes. Yes. In Berlin, yeah, Nichanagar, wonderful.
In that song, Bombay.
Yeah, Johnny Walker.
Yes.
We could have a whole session just singing songs about cities.
Yes, how many cities are coming up, how the life is changing, how people are adjusting, how they're doing partitions,
In fact, I quote this Johnny Walker song in my chapter. I'm delighted to listen to it again. You have to.
Not a question actually, and I'm very happy to listen to you both and some thoughts and statements. So initially when you started the talk, you shared this thing about two routes which can take you to the office, and how same thing. I mean, I was reminded of how I used to have this argument or request my father, like whenever we going or like coming back, to take a particular route and not to take the other one, because that is like and especially when new people were coming to Delhi, as I'm from Kerala, so sometimes my cousins or like for IS studies and all, so we used to warn him like while going to the railway station that when you come back, please don't take them from that particular route, because the first impression which they will have of the city, because especially for Malayalis, and we have seen the Malayalam movies in which Delhi is shown, only the Rajpath. Rajpath cannot be resisted. And we think that every place in Delhi is similar to that, like Lobi Garden or Rajpath, and the place we live in is contrast and completely different from. So this morning, I mean, my father to save petrol, he'll always prefer the So, but then later thinking about it, I realized that the route which I wanted to avoid is the one where the poor people live in. I mean, the lower straight out society, and that is what disturbs us in certain sense. The kind of, I mean, seeing it every day. So in somewhere you want to kind of turn your head against that, or to kind of not see it.
Yes.
So there again, and then you also mentioned about aesthetics as a right. So maybe when you deny the basic hygiene or basic things in life, aesthetics becomes something which is only secondary. When the primary things are denied, so there's some thoughts and then.
Yeah, but I to say that it's I mean, obviously these things, space is important, and the right to, just how much space you need to live in. I asked a French philosopher this question, and I said, how much space do you think one needs to live in, so that there's a degree of well-being? And he was not very comfortable, he didn't answer me properly. Of course, one can't establish, but you can see that people live in palatial houses and huge gardens. On the other hand, people don't even have a spot of a little tree or a potted plant next to them. So there has to be some thought on this, not simply as a secondary, as a luxury, but that is like we need roads, we need, we need transport, we need water, we need power, but we also need this. So I think instead of thinking that, okay, it's the way development is thought about. First, develop this, then you can think about something else, which was what the Indian government was told by the United States. Why are you developing a space program? First, first remove poverty. So there are arguments like that. And I think today we should think about this, that, why are, for example, in European cities, the poor being comforted with social housing, a small flat, okay, they've got a roof on their head, but then they'll be surrounded by car parks, they'll be at a distance from the city, there is no light there. The young people will come down and just loiter around, and they are completely divorced, and then everybody complains, oh, they're becoming violent, oh, they deal with drugs, oh, they... But there is, this is a very difficult way to live. So I would say it's not even a secondary, it's altogether. It's a complete package. It's like you start arguing, oh, eyes are more important than the heart, and the tongue is less important than our feet. Like, it's all important, no? So I think, that's the way I feel strongly about it. Thank you very much. I find it very comforting that, it's similar experience. Here's our history, here's our past, we're very ancient, we're not new, so it perhaps added to the...
No, that's true, because these images were not mainly destined to inhabitants. They were for, they were to be sold to foreigners or travelers, or not for local people. So it's a way of presenting out the city outside.
Showing the best face.
Yeah, I don't have any question, but thank you so much for enlightening us on a very different note for this very city. I was looking into some of the articles by Institute of Asian Studies, University of Leiden. They have recently launched a project, I think just 1 or 2 years back, on the Asian cities. And I was reading some of the articles on the waterscapes, on the landscapings, and they were very interesting. And a very different way of interpreting the way we see the cities. So the project name is Asian Cities.
Yes. Yeah. And there was a big project launched by the London School of Economics. And so this is, like I said, there's just so much literature, so many workshops on this question, because it's one of the hot subjects of the present moment. How do we deal with urban sprawl, from different points of view, energy perspective, environment, climate, etc. So urban studies is not a new discipline, but it's
They launched a project out of Asian cities.
Yes.
But what is new now in the contemporary world, the fact that the huge majority of the population of the world is now living in cities.
Yes.
India is still an exception in the world panorama. So it's a main question.
Yeah.
I think there are no questions left. So with this, we'll be going forward with our session. Thank you, the audience and the professors alike, for the inquisitive and enlightening question and answer round. So today, now I would like to welcome the teacher in charge of the History Association, Dr. Rita Raj, to deliver a token of thanks and present a token of appreciation to our guests.
And I would like to invite my colleagues also to come.
Thank you. I think, when we talk about one's own work, we always tend to talk longer. And so I feel a little guilty. I started off first and I took some of his time. And I hope I haven't overshot too much into your lunch time, because that is very important.
On behalf of the Department of History and my colleagues and students, I would like to thank Professor Arundhati Virmani and Professor Boutier for coming here and giving us a very different perspective on how to approach new questions and new issues. And also, especially, I would also like to say that I was talking about the Oral History Archive initiative that, we've just started. One of our advisory board members is Professor Alessandro Portelli. He's the doyen of oral history, and after our first advisory board meeting, he forwarded to me some of the audio recordings of the sounds of Nizamuddin Aulia Dargah. And now after this talk, I think I now know what to do about it. The fact that sounds and not noises are also very important for historical investigation. And we will keep it as a part of our oral history archive here as well, and probably try to understand Nizamuddin Aulia through those sound recordings that Alexander Botelli has sent us. So thank you a lot for your time here and for this extended discussion. I especially want to thank my colleagues here who are always there as constant pillars of support, as those tall skyscrapers we have here in our Department of History. So thank you so much for your time always. Thank you to all the student coordinators from the third years as well as the second years who are here today. Thank you to the Vice President of History Association, Ms. Kanji. There are also students who come from other colleges as well. Thank you so much for your time here. And thank you, dear students of History Department, for being here, sitting and engaging with the issues that are being discussed. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. With this, we have come to the end of our event. We extend our sincere gratitude to our speakers, Professor Arundhati Virmani and Professor Boutier, for taking out time and gracing us with their incredible knowledge. Further, we thank our principal, Professor Sandra Joseph, for letting us organize this event. We also thank our convener, Dr. Richa Raj, and our co-convener, Dr. Sanghamitra Rai Verman, for guiding us and encouraging us to organize this event. Further, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Amitabh Paliwal, Dr. Maya John, Dr. Danu Parashar, and Sonu ma'am and the entire history department for their constant support in organizing this event. We also like to thank our office bearer, Vice President Muskan Joshi, Further, we extend our thanks to our college caretaker, Tatiana sir, and others who helped with the logistics, Kayla sir, Vishen sir, and the entire team in setting up this MPH.